Okay, next I want to take a look at the question of whether or not Daniel 8 should be interpreted as 2,300 literal years. So let's take a look again here. So I've crossed off the top, the Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, because I believe that they are not related. You may interpret as you find appropriate. I'm going to take a look, though, at Daniel 8 specifically, and whether or not that is related to 2,000, whether it should be interpreted as meaning 2,300 literal years. Okay, there's a couple things that go with this. First, in order for that to be true, we must have two very large assumptions. Number one assumption is that a day must equal a literal year, and Daniel 8 must mean 2,300 days. Both of those have to be correct. So I'm going to go through a couple proof texts here. Here are the proof texts often given for the argument that a day is equal to a year. So I'm going to go ahead and look at both of these. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of prophecy that was fulfilled within biblical times that had a time measure associated with it. And here's the list I'm going to look at. Additionally, I'm going to talk about the concept of apocalyptic prophecy, which is kind of a new thing. It really hasn't been a term that was used originally, but we'll mention it. And then finally, as it relates to a day for a year, we'll talk about some inconsistent interpretations. For example, Revelation 20 that references 1,000 years and is interpreted as literally being 1,000 years, not a day for a year in that period of time. Also, the idea of 42 months being somehow related to a day for a year. If so, how did we establish how many days there are in a month? And where's a biblical text to support that view? Because the length of months not only has varied greatly over time, each nation has had their own interpretation as to what a month means. And at the time that this was written, and at the time even that we talk about it now, it depends on what nation you're in and what a month actually means. So if you accept and believe that 42 months really is a day for a year and it's exactly 30 days for each month, well, that might be something that's that maybe you have a verse to justify that I haven't seen, and I'd appreciate a note on that. And let's dive in. Okay. In order for Daniel 8 to be interpreted as 2,300 years, we must assume that a day is a year. So let's work through that assumption first. So there are two proof texts associated with this. Let's flip over and take a look. So this one comes from, the first one comes from Numbers. The context here, remember, this is when the children of Israel sent out a group of 12 people into the land of Canaan to spy out the land, and they came back and they started off saying, hey, it's a great land, it's wonderful. However, we can't go because the people there are big and they'll hurt us. And that's essentially the context. So this is the specific verse that's being used to justify a day equaling a year. All right, let's take a look. So here we are, Numbers 14, verse 34 says, after the number of days in which ye search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. Okay, a couple of things going on here. First off, this is obviously a punishment. The lineup of days to years, and the spies were killed before the Lord is the culmination of how all this worked out, except for Joshua and Caleb. So the important thing in this passage is that this was a punishment. Yes, a day was expanded to be a year. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Now let's flip over to Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 6. All right, so verse 6 says, first the context. So Ezekiel is an interesting prophet. He was given several tasks that he had to perform to demonstrate to Israel their sinfulness, and some of them were pretty wild. This is one of them. He was going to have to lay on his side, and he was going to be tied with ropes. He was going to lay on his side a certain number of days for the sins of Israel, and then flip over to the other side for the sins of Judah. This is the context of this particular statement. So, and when thou hast completed them, this is lying on one side, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. So the implication there is that 40 years was the total time that Judah was in iniquity beyond Israel, because Israel, the northern kingdom, was destroyed first, and Judah lasted another 40 years. Okay, so this is another punishment. But there's a significant difference here. Which of these two is not like the other? So there's a significant difference between this. In our passage in Numbers, we had the number of days that the spies were in the land became years. It expanded. In Ezekiel, we have the number of years of iniquity that Israel and Judah compressed to be a number of days. So while there may be a correlation, at least in this punishment, between days and years, it is not consistent. We can't say that a day is a year automatically based on these passages, because these two passages don't agree on how that correlation would occur. And we've just looked at a whole ton of passages in prophecy, or we're going to in a few minutes, that will show more detail around prophecy. So these two, Numbers and Ezekiel, these two passages, neither one of them are prophecy. Neither one of them is predicting something that is to occur into the future, other than, of course, a punishment. The passage in Numbers does say that the people are going to fall, they're going to die in the wilderness. I guess we call that a prophecy. But if we do, then we have to accept that he says that they're going to be 40 years, and that is the literal length of time that they were in the wilderness. And if we're calling it a prophecy, the prophecy portion of that said years. Now, where we got the years and how the years were applied, how he came up with the idea of the years, that's the year for the day part. The same applies to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was indeed laying on his side for some period of days. And that is the period of time he was laying on his side. He was not laying on his side for Judah here for this example. He wasn't laying there for 40 years. He was lying on his side for 40 days. So the prophecy portion of this, even if we want to call this a prophecy, the prophecy portion is clearly exactly what it says. There is no day-year connection here. Okay? It's important to recognize that. If we're going to use passages like this to try to justify the idea that a day in Bible prophecy represents a year, then why not 1,000 years? Because 1,000 years to the Lord is like a day, and a day is 1,000 years. Or any number of other passages that happens to make a connection between time, we could apply any number of ways. These passages do not show biblical consistency in interpreting a prophecy. That's the point. This dips its toe into what's called biblical numerology. It's a way of trying to manipulate numbers and try to find patterns based on what numbers mean. This is kind of where a lot of this stuff dips its toe, and it's not biblically consistent. Okay. Now, let's talk for a second about apocalyptic prophecy. Before I go into the next section, I want to talk about that. This has become pretty popular recently. This is not how this was originally interpreted, and you're welcome to go read the chapter in Great Controversy on that topic. Actually, hang on a second. We'll go look it up. Okay, I'm going to flip over again and we'll just take a look at this passage real quick. Okay, this is from the ellenwhite.info. This is a site where you can go online and find a lot of these books. This is from chapter 18 of the Great Controversy. We're going to read a couple paragraphs here. Okay. The prophecy which seemed most clearly to reveal the time of the second advent was Daniel 8:14. Unto 2,300 days then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Following this rule of making Scripture its own interpreter, Miller, that's William Miller, learned that a day in symbolic prophecy represents a year, and it references two passages we just looked at. He saw that the period of 2,300 prophetic days, or literal years, would extend far beyond the close of Jewish dispensation. Hence, it could not refer to the sanctuary of that dispensation. Miller accepted the generally received view that in the Christian age, the earth is the sanctuary, and that he therefore understood the cleansing of the sanctuary foretold in Daniel 8:14 represents a purification of the earth by fire and the second coming of Christ. Okay. Let's stop there for just a moment. If we read what is in Great Controversy, and this was the popular view as written. The day represents a year in prophecy until very recently, and then the term apocalyptic prophecy started to be used, and an apocalyptic prophecy is a term that was created to segregate between the examples I'm going to show you, where the Bible prophecies exist within Bible times, and we could see they literally fulfilled even to the day of the prophecy time. Where apocalyptic prophecy is something that goes well beyond that period of time. Definition and how to determine whether it's apocalyptic or not is somewhat nebulous, and the term isn't even used in the Bible, actually, other than perhaps the end of the New Testament. The book of Revelation in Greek is known as Apocalypsis. So that's perhaps where some of that comes from. Anyway, okay, so now let's go into some specifics, specific examples where prophecy in the Bible was fulfilled within biblical times, and see what that looks like, how those prophecies were written, because it's important. Once we have an established pattern, we can use that pattern to try to predict. That's the purpose of a pattern. We establish what we know, and then from that we extrapolate what we do not know. So, by the way, this aspect of the prophecy interpretation is not disputed. Everybody agrees that these are interpreted the way I'm going to show you, but for the purpose of completeness, we're going to look at them. Okay, so first, let's take a look at the book of Jonah. So Jonah, 3 verse 4, Jonah was sent as the prophet to Nineveh. All right, and this is what he said. And Jonah began to enter the city, into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." Okay, he said 40 days. So here's our day prophecy. If what we have read, that prophecy, going all the way back to Exodus, or the book of Numbers in the Torah, if what we've read is true, then we should be able to take a year for day prophecy. He probably meant 40 years. However, we see in the next chapter, in Jonah 4, that Jonah is sitting up on a hill upset with God because he pardoned Nineveh. And arguably, how would Jonah know that he pardoned Nineveh, except that the 40-day period passed and Nineveh was not destroyed? In fact, if we look at history and when Nineveh actually was wiped out in the Assyrian nation, it was about 100 years after Jonah, probably, give or take a few dates. Bottom line is it was certainly not within 40 years. So the day-year thing does not work here, right? Basically, everybody agrees on this point. Again, just for the purpose of completeness. Let's look at another one. So here we are, Yirmiyahu, chapter 25, verse 11. This is Jeremiah's prophecy concerning the captivity of and the wipeout of Jerusalem and the city of Judah. We actually already saw the other side of this prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, but here's the prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11. It says, "And the whole land shall be desolate and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years." Okay. How long was that really? I go look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 2. "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the books the number of years, whereof the Lord came to Jeremiah, where the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, and he would accomplish 70 years in desolation of Jerusalem." Okay, so the years in Jeremiah's prophecy were literal. 70 years, you're going to be wiped out for 70 years. At the end of 70 years, Daniel did not wonder whether that really meant 70 years or not. He read the prophecy. He trusted that that was 70 years. There's no recorded debate in Daniel's mind on whether this was supposed to be a day for a year thing or any of this other interpretational gymnastics. He was pretty clear on what that meant. Let's look at Genesis, Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. "And he said unto Abram," this is God speaking to Abraham, giving him a promise of, or the prediction of what was going to happen to the children of Israel in their time in Egypt. Okay, so he says, "And unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in the land which is not theirs, and they shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 100 years. Well, how long was that really? Let's flip over to the book of Exodus, and we find out. Exodus chapter 12. This is chapter 12. Verse 40 and 41 says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." Okay. The 30 years, by the way, was a period of time. The difference there, the 30 years, is when Joseph was in charge. And remember, another king arose that did not know Joseph, and that's when they were pressed into slavery. Okay, so it was literally 400 years. 400 years. Okay, let's look at a couple more. Noah, from the back to the book of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 6. We have, "And Noah said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. Okay, how long does that mean? We find from Genesis chapter 7 that the flood came in Noah's 600th year. And we find from Genesis chapter 5, the previous, at the end of the chapter, it refers to Noah being 500 years old and having 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if you're willing to accept that the difference between 500 and 600, or 120, the 20 years there being time it took to have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, perhaps, then we could see that the time, it is indeed 120 years, but most certainly not a day for a year, meaning that this is like thousands of years. Certainly not. Okay. Now, if we go to the next chapter, and look at Genesis 7, verses 4. Says, "For yet 7 days, and I will cause rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing, etc., will be destroyed." Okay, so 7 days, there's going to be rain, and it's going to last for 40 days. So 7 more days, we're going to have rain. It's going to last for 40 days. Is that 7 years, or is it 7 days? Is it 40 years, or is it 40 days? It's completely possible and practical even that this would mean years. You could interpret this as meaning years. It would make sense to say that in 7 years there will be a flood. That would make sense. This is not one of the prophecies where it would put it so far out there that you can't explain it. This actually makes perfect sense if we're going to say that it was 7 years. And 40 years of rain, it's a lot of rain. It's possible. But for sure, that's even, but it wasn't. If you read further down the passage, we know that in 7 days, and it says on the selfsame day, Noah entered the ark and it began to rain. And we also find that the rain lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And then they were in the boat for a much longer period of time. A lot of people don't remember that from the book, from the passage. But it was actually raining for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so that's Noah. Like I said, none of these are in dispute. Everybody agrees on these points. All right, so let's look at Genesis chapter 40. Okay, this is a couple from the story of Joseph. So Joseph, Genesis chapter 40, had the cupbearer and the baker and the butler. It's called the cupbearer in the King James. So anyway, these officials of the king were imprisoned with Joseph, and they had a dream. And they asked, or whether Joseph volunteered. Anyway, Joseph was going to tell them the interpretation of their dream. So Joseph's interpretation and the prediction was, "Within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you shall deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand," etc. That's verse 13. He had a similar prediction in verse 19 for the baker. He didn't have as good of fortune. He was going to be impaled, etc. Okay. This one, completely possible, would make sense to be interpreted as 3 years. Maybe they hung out for 3 years in prison. Joseph was in here for another 2 years. So this is not beyond the realm of possibility at all. It makes complete sense. So interpreting this as day versus year is possible. But what do we find out? Look in verse 20. It says, "And it came to pass, on the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he made a feast and with the servants, and he lifted up the heads of the butler and the chief baker." And there you go. A day for a day, not a day for a year. Okay? Now, let's take a look. Let's take one more look at Joseph, actually. Let's go back over here and look at Genesis 41. This is when Joseph is interpreting the dream. This is after a couple of years, and he's interpreting the dream for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh had a dream with 7 cows and 7 stalks of ears of corn. Here's the interpretation that Joseph gives. It says, "The 7 good kine and the 7 years and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one and the same." Okay. And he interprets this. If you keep on reading through here, through this paragraph, you find that he interprets that there will be 7 years of famine, or 7 years of good, and then 7 years of famine. Interestingly, in the Hebrew here, it says 7 years of sabah, satisfaction, and then 7 years of hunger. Okay, so it's interesting how it words that. But let's go see what the fulfillment is. Genesis 45. Genesis 45 verse 6 says, and this is where Joseph is talking to his brothers, and he says to them, "For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall be neither earing nor harvest." Okay, so Joseph believes that this is 7 years literally, which is fortunate, because if it was a year for a day, there would probably be no Egypt. So that's what we've got so far. All right, none of these, none, have been symbolic day for a year. And if you know of any example that can be demonstrated where we can draw a reference from what exists and that we can see to something else, I'm all ears to hear about it. But let's look for a couple more. Okay. This is from Daniel, same book that we're talking about here, chapter 4. Now, there's a couple things you need to know about the book of Daniel. A lot of people are not aware of this. If you're seriously studying this, you should be aware of this. The book of Daniel actually is currently in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. It's actually in 2 languages as its source language. One of them, and this portion is one of those where it's written in, it's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic as its source language. The chapter 1 and a very small portion of chapter 2 are in Hebrew, and then chapter 8 on are in Hebrew, but everything else is Aramaic, which is one of the common reasons given why the book of Daniel is written is within the Ketuvim in the Tanakh, and it's not listed, which is called the writings, or the wisdom books, and not listed among the prophets. But there's a lot of debate about that, and it's irrelevant. This is the point here, is not whether or not Daniel was, whether he had prophecies within the book. There is a little bit of a debate on whether or not Daniel was actually a prophet. There's a difference between interpreting and understanding, and it's to the point of splitting hairs. Most of the last part of the book, Daniel did not understand. So those parts where Daniel was directly involved in receiving visions, he did not understand them and had to have them explained, etc. So in that way, he differs from many of the other prophets. But the reality is that most of the prophets did not understand, at least not fully, the vision. Does it matter for the purpose of understanding this? Does it make it any less true or false? I think the answer to that is no. It's a technical evaluation of Daniel's understanding, and I think there's value in that to try to understand how God works in different ways. Because take Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, big 3 prophets. God worked with each of them in a very different way. They absolutely were not treated the same. So we should not believe in any case that God works with everybody the same way. So anyway, so the book of Daniel is in the Ketuvim. It is not in the Nevi'im. It's not in the section of the prophets in the Tanakh. So regardless, all of that to say this, okay? So Daniel 4 verse 16. So this is the prophecy where Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "Hey, watch out, because you had this dream of the tree, etc. Would this, he makes a prediction here. He says that Daniel said that the 7 times that were to pass over the tree with the bands of iron brass represent the 7 times we're going to pass over Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, and 7 times, that is a term. And remember, this is different language. This isn't the Hebrew portion of the Bible, but this is 7 years. He's saying here. He's literally saying this will be 7 years, and the interpretation comes out at the end that it was when the days were completed, then Nebuchadnezzar lifted up his head and saw that the justice in his action. Okay, so that's what we've got. So far we've got all of these examples that were literal, they were direct, whatever was predicted was precisely what came true. And why does that matter? The Bible that was given when a prediction was given. It was given to demonstrate that God was in control and had a power and authority. So when he predicted precisely when something was going to occur or how long it was going to occur, it demonstrated that he was involved and had the power to work in men's lives. And that's something that we should be very careful about removing, trying to make the period of time different than what the Bible actually says. Okay, so those are the basic examples, and I can hear you now. Wait a minute, what about the 70 weeks? Calm down. We're going to look at that here in just a second, but I want to talk about the other examples where this is used inconsistently. For example, 1,000 years. The millennium in heaven spoken in Revelation 20. This is not interpreted as 365 or 360, depending on your usage. It's not interpreted as being a day for a year. It's interpreted as literally that length of time. Why is that? There is a mishmash of use of day for year in Revelation. It's not interpreted consistently. So this is one of those things where I kind of have to shrug and say, yeah, it is written the way it is for a reason. Are we trying to rewrite it? Do we not like the numbers that are there and we're trying to rewrite them? Do we not understand what those numbers mean? Perhaps there's something here we're missing. Okay, now let's talk about the idea of Daniel 8:14 as it's recorded in the King James Version says unto 2,300 days. Is that an accurate interpretation? Can we correlate between Daniel 8:14? If it does say days, can that be applied to days for years? If it doesn't say days, then we have an additional problem with the interpretation of days for years. So let's figure out, does Daniel 8:14 really say days? Now, of course, in the King James it does, but the Bible wasn't written in King James. It was written in Hebrew and some other languages. So let's examine the source. All right, so here we go. Let's flip over and take a look. Here's the passage that we're specifically interested in. All right, so Daniel 8:14. This is again from Bible Hub, and I'm going to show you some tools on this particular site I'm using here is Bible Hub. He said unto me unto 2,300 days. Now in this, the King James, usually when the King James is filling in words to help make context, it will italicize those words, and it helps us know that that wasn't in the original text. As a technical person, I can tell you that the only thing worse than having no information at all is having inconsistent information. In this case, this is inconsistent because the word days here is actually filled in. They removed other words and put in the words days. And I'll demonstrate that. All right, so let's take a look. Here we go. So Daniel 8, let's look at the interlinear, and we're going to look at the whole chapter just for simplicity. All right, so scrolling down, Daniel 8:14. V'yomer Eli od erev boker. Okay, so what this says, and he said to me, yet evening and morning. It doesn't actually have the word morning. It really just says evening, morning. And then Eliphaim Veshalosh Ma'ot, 2,300. There's no days. The days are not here. Now, in the writing in Daniel, this is a topic maybe we'll talk about some other time, but the the numbering and the way that the numbers occur, cardinal numbers for Hebrew, is that they occur after the noun to which they modify. So this is not an uncommon way. This is common in Daniel. Erev Boker Elifim Veshlosh Mayot. So 2,000 and 300s. And then this word here is Ve'netzarik. That's the same word from which Zarik is the word that means righteousness or clean. In fact, in the back of a synagogue, there's a little blue box, and it has written on it tzedakah, and it means righteousness. That's the purpose. So cleaned, it's not cleaned like sweeping with a broom. It's clean like moral cleansing, to put right, to make whole, right? And kodesh, in this case, really is just the holy. It doesn't say sanctuary per se, but kodesh is frequently used. The word kodesh, which really just means holy, the set apart, is frequently used in that way. Okay, so that's what we've got here. Erev Boker. Where do we first hear that? Those words first appear in Genesis 1. It's where we hear V'yahi Erev, V'yahi Boker, Yom Achat, for example. And there was evening and there was morning one day. That's how the text reads in the Hebrew. Okay, so let's look at where this possibly would have come from. For Vulgate, you know that the Old Testament and King James, a lot of that was not originally from Hebrew. They pulled from either the Vulgate, the Latin, or from Septuagint, from the Greek. Here we have the Vulgate and the Septuagint are online, so we can find out. We can see it, check the sources. Both the Vulgate and the Septuagint have the evening and morning put in here. Both of them added the word days. So let's take a look here. And he said unto him, unto evenings and mornings, there's no and in the Hebrew, but that's okay, it makes more sense, 2,300 days, and the sanctuary will be cleansed. Okay, the days there isn't even in the passage in Hebrew for sure. So the days is added, but the rest of this is actually a fairly good interpretation into the Latin. Here's the Greek and the English interpretation of the Greek. So he said unto him, evenings and mornings there will be. That's the od, and then that is correct. Literally, it's like yet. Evenings and morning yet 2,300 is what the Hebrew says. But there shall be is not a bad way to say that. 2,300 days. So evenings and mornings is represented. This is not a bad interpretation, 2,300, and then they add days, and then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Okay, so both the Vulgate and the Septuagint recognize that evenings and mornings was supposed to be there. Both of them, for some reason, add the word days into the passage. When it got to the King James, they what we see in here is just the days that makes it to the passage. Okay, a little bit interesting. Let's look at something else. Let's take a look at the Bishop's Bible. You may not know this, but the King James Bible actually sourced, it was an update of the Bishop's Bible, and some of the material, how much was included, I don't know, obviously not this part, because here's the Bishop's Bible. So, and I'll put some links in the thing for all this. So here's 8:14. It says, you gotta love the spelling here, as if I don't already have enough hard time reading. And he answered unto me, unto the evenings and the mornings, 2,300. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Okay, That's the bishop's Bible. This is the Bible that they were updating because it had so many errors that they were correcting those that's why the authorized version was written, because this Bible was known to have a lot of errors. So even this version had the 2,300. All right, or the evenings and mornings. Okay, one more thing I want you to look at, and this might be a little shocking. Did you know that in Daniel 8, the term evenings and mornings, or evenings and mornings, occurs twice, and the other time it's actually interpreted correctly? Let's take a look. All right, so Daniel 8, if we go down to verse 26, okay, V'mara'a ha'erev v'ha'boker asher ne'amer emet. All right, and the vision, the evenings and the mornings, which was told is true. Okay, so when you read that in King James, the evenings and mornings actually is interpreted in verse 26. It says that correctly. The only time it's not interpreted in the entire Bible, that it's not interpreted correctly, is in this passage, Daniel 8:14. Now, let's go back. I want to show you another tool here that's actually helpful. If you go and look at 2,300, okay, right here, see where it says this word 1242? That's the Strong's number. Now, over here on the Englishman's Concordance, so there's boker right there. That's the word. It means morning. It's correct. So they even acknowledge that it means morning. There's not a whole bunch of different interpretations here. If you look at the breakout of where all of these are used, how many times do we see the word day for boker? That would be 1. And you can scroll through every single instance over here on the right side for the Englishman's Concordance, if you wish. And you will find that, with the exception of Daniel 8:14, this word is 100% translated as morning, because that's what it means. Now, sometimes it has an implication that it may mean days, but that isn't the case here. The evening and morning is specific and unique and explicit. It's actually a technical term. There were evening and morning sacrifices, and this passage is talking about sacrifices. So when we talk about the evening and the morning, it makes a lot of sense to consider that the evening and morning was written there for a reason, and that they weren't trying to say days. So let's take a look at that. Remember that starting this section, he's talking about the little horn taking away the daily. What does that even mean? Well, I think that, I don't know if anybody disagrees on this part, and if they do, that's fine. I'm going to show you what the connection between that and the rest of the Bible means, not taking it out of context. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Let's flip over here. If we look at Exodus 29, starting in verse 38, all the way through the end, and this is in the King James, so you can see that this is marked out as being the daily offerings. So this is the daily that they talked about. And you can see here in verse 39, it says, the one lamb thou shalt offer in the morning, and the other lamb shalt thou offer at even. And then they had additional offerings for the Sabbath, and there's offerings for Rosh Chodesh, and for Rosh Hashanah, and other and for feasts and all kinds of stuff. But this is a specific reference to the daily. Okay. Okay, and then there's one more thing here that's really important. That if you miss all the rest of the stuff related to days and the evenings and mornings, this is important, because I think that this really puts the nail in the coffin around the discussion of whether this is supposed to be days or whether it literally refers to evenings and morning sacrifices, which is the context of the passage. Okay, so let's flip over here. We're going to look at the interlinear for verse 38. Okay, this is the verse just before when he's describing what this will be. Okay, so verse 38 refers to the evening and morning sacrifice as the continually. Okay, day after day. Okay, so what this says right here is the word is tamid. Tamid means forever, continuing. Okay. I bet you want to guess what word is used in Daniel 8, specifically referring to the sacrifices when he said he was going to take away the daily. Let's take a look. So I'm going to flip up here to Daniel. For some reason my mouse always rolls past Daniel. All right, so there we go. And that's okay. So let's take a look here in verse 11. Okay, so Daniel 8 verse 11. This is what it refers to, the daily sacrifices. The word is hatamid, the continual, or the eternal, if you will. That's how those sacrifices are referred. Now, if we click that word in Strong's, there's tamid, and it says that's true. Okay, so if we scroll through here, first off, you can see how many times it's used in various things. We have regular sacrifices that gets used 5 times. Regularly is a good interpretation for sure. Okay, so let's scroll through here. And you can see all of these passages are burning offering, burning incense, burning on the altar, the grain offering, etc. And that's why in Daniel 9, although the word sacrifices, or Daniel 8, why the word sacrifice isn't in there, that's why the Bible interpreted that way, because that's how the word is used. Continually a burnt offering, in addition to the burnt offering, etc. Okay, so, and we're only up to numbers, and we've had a whole bunch of uses. So let's hit the 104 use case. And I'm going to scroll down just for the purpose of cheating. Okay, so in Daniel 8:11, it's interpreted in King James to say, of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. They understood the context. They knew what this was. And the evenings and mornings is directly related to the daily sacrifice that this passage is talking about. And that's what was spoken about in the book of Exodus that we just read. And the same wording occurs in Daniel 8:12 and Daniel 8:13. Just before the statement, the question about how long this is going to occur, that's in Daniel 8:13. That's the question. That's the setup. The removing of the sacrifice is the setup for that's the question about, and the answer is 2,300 days. Okay, but the same thing occurs in Daniel 11, and it's referring to regular sacrifices. Daniel 12, the daily sacrifices. This word is consistently used. So here we are. The word says, in the context, in the passage surrounding the passage that is being interpreted as 2,300 days in King James, when almost everybody else doesn't interpret that way, including the Vulgate and the Septuagint, which were source material for this, and the Bishop's Bible, which was the predecessor. Nobody else interprets it that way. That's not what it says in Hebrew. The context of the passage is clearly speaking about sacrifices and using the exact same words associated with the sacrifices. It doesn't mean days. It cannot mean days. It's not what it's talking about. So days is the wrong word there, which means that if days is the wrong word, then even if Daniel 8:14 is related to Daniel 9, and even if a day really does mean a year in prophecy, this isn't talking about a day. It's talking about daily sacrifices. So, again, we seem to have a little bit of a problem here. Okay?